Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink I have in sample form, and it's by Noodlers. It's from their Warden series, and this one is Black Moccasin. Now, what are the Warden series? It's sort of their ultra-permanent ink, even though Noodlers Black is called bulletproof. Warden series is like a whole new crazy level. So, Black Moccasin, it doesn't glow under UV, it's not lubricated, and it doesn't resist freezing, but it is UV resistant, bleach resistant, archival, fade proof, impervious to lasers, alcohol, solvents. It's fully waterproof. It's insane. This would probably survive the nuclear apocalypse. So, yeah. It's an ultra black, that's for sure. And the two pens I used to test it were these. This is a Pilot Metropolitan with a Japanese medium, so it's kind of more in line with a Western fine. And a JinHao X450, and my X450s tend to be pretty broad and pretty wet, and this one generally is. Alrighty. Now, I'm going to show you some comparisons. They may not be necessarily comparable in properties, because I don't know many inks that are like laser resistant, but yeah, as you can tell, this is an ultra dark, dense black ink. And here's another Noodlers ultra black. This is Noodlers Borealis black. And this one is designed to sort of act like Aurora, the brand's black ink, so it's very lubricated and very dark. Another one I had was Pilot's Black from the cartridges, which is also an extremely dense dark black, however it doesn't have the best behavior. Another Noodler's Black, this one's also an ultra black, but this one is exclusive to Wonder Pens of Canada. This is Raven Black. Noodlers, ultra black, it's their thing. And lastly, I have Diamine's Onyx Black, which you might be able to tell is not quite as dark, but what you're seeing is actually sheen, which is very rare on this. This is 32-pound all cotton bond paper, which if you're familiar with paper, it can actually be pretty absorbent, so it's hard to get sheen on paper like this, but somehow Onyx Black did that, so, But yeah, there you go, there are your comparisons. Let's check out chromatography. Hang on while I zoom in. Okay. So this one on the left with the tiny little D up in the corner, that is the one that I let dry, which is not how you're supposed to do it, but I feel like it's taught me some things over the years. This one is the one that I did the way you're supposed to, where you put the line of ink and essentially instantly drop it in the water. And as you might be able to tell, there's already some indicators that this might be water resistant. You can see, even though this barely had seconds to soak in, you can still see that something's there, those lines, and there's a definite line of demarcation. And then we have this interesting, like, gold, like dusty green gold color, and then we have this bits of, like, slate blue, and then we get this patchy dark black with this gray up at the top. Fascinating. Now the one that I let dry, and this only dried for maybe 8 to 10 minutes, significant difference, as you can tell. The line is incredibly dark. Yeah, we get much less of the gold up through here, but we still get little hints of the slate and the extremely dense black and then the gray up at the top. But yeah, so there's that. Let's look at some chemical tests, for lack of a better word. Now, because I knew that the Warden series was ultra resistant, I have to admit I was really, really scrubbing these in. So, water test. Yeah, so this had maybe an hour to dry on here, this smear. And actually most Noodlers inks, the way they work, they actually have to bond to the cellulose fibers of the paper, which is not instantaneous. It takes time. In fact, I think the recommended time for most of them is 3 days to achieve full permanence. This one had an hour, and then I took a Q-tip with water and just absolutely scrubbed it. And what you're seeing is not necessarily the ink breaking up so much as the paper starting to come apart, which I thought was rather fascinating. 1/3 bleach solution kind of did the same thing. I was scrubbing it and it started to pull the paper apart, It was almost like redistributing little bits of the paper that I had scrubbed off. Yeah, bleach did not get rid of it. It did turn it sort of this weird gold color. But there you go. Ammonia pen flesh kind of got it moving, but mostly in the sense that it really, really broke up the paper. I was worried about just the whole paper coming apart. Hydrogen peroxide actually didn't do that much, which is nice. At least it's, you know, super resistant to that after an hour. Now, paper test. Top down in density, Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Yeah, this is an ultra black. If you're looking for something that is ridiculously indelible and extremely dark, this is it. Yeah, it's an extremely dense black ink. I sort of don't know how to describe it, but it feels thick. Like there's a lot of stuff in this. Not necessarily like you're gonna feel like you're putting maple syrup through your pen, but it just, I can't describe it. It feels like there's a lot of stuff in there and you can kind of feel it. It's not super wet. It's maybe a 5 out of 10, and it can dry on the nib a bit. Not ridiculously quickly like some fast dry inks can, but, or not fast dry inks. Like the Noodlers Eternal series, like that can happen. But anyways, now I personally do not like shading in my black inks. I know I'm probably a minority in that, but yeah, this doesn't shade at all. This is an ultra black. It is deep and dark and dense, and that Japanese medium, which is more like a Western fine, took 20 seconds to dry. The fairly brown wet JinHao took 31. And I don't know if this is going to show up, but where it's laid on heaviest, it almost gets shiny. But yeah, holy moly. There's no real bleed, feather, spread, echo, sheen. That's all good. Water test, again, this had maybe about an hour. And yeah, an hour is still more impressive than a lot of other inks can say ever, because holy moly, look at that. That is very clear, that is very there, that is absolutely readable. It barely let go at all, and you can probably see just how hard I was scrubbing that paper. You can see that the paper's starting to come apart. Because this ink sort of touted itself as ultra resistant, I was really going hard on it. So, yeah, an hour. Holy moly. Now, next up is Fabriano Eco Quad. It's an 85 gram per square meter paper. I really love this stuff. The more I use it, the more I enjoy it. It actually is often able to handle inks that other papers can kind of struggle with. This one, though, it kind of surprised me. I said there was some near echo on here where laid on heaviest. And I'd say that's mostly in the scrubby, but still it surprised me because Eco Qua often, for me in my experience, it's really durable. So I just wanted to make a note of it, even though you can barely see it and it's mostly the scrubby. It so surprised me, I just wanted to point it out. Now again, this is just an ultra black. It is extremely dark. There is no shading, where it's laid on heaviest. We almost get like a shine. Yeah. Japanese medium took 18 seconds to dry. The fairly brown wet JinHao took 29. And if you look at those smears, I mean, just look at the sheer density of that ink. That's intense. But yeah, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Again, in an hour, and even with intense scrubbing, that's what we get. It is extremely dark. I mean, look at this medium. It barely even looks any different. I'd say the JinHao barely looks any different. It maybe dyed the page just a tiniest bit, but I'm not even sure I can claim that, because like on camera you can't even see it, and in person it's very difficult to notice. Wow. Next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. I feel like everyone's kind of familiar with this stuff at this point. Yeah, we kind of get more of the same. It's just dark black. It is dense. It is very yeah, it's intense. It's almost like intensely dark, and again, it can dry on the nib a little bit, which for me was a bit frustrating because I was switching between pens. I'm sure most of you are not going to be switching between pens. But yeah, anyways, that Japanese medium took 19 seconds to dry. Fairly broad wet JinHao took 32. I just want you to see like how thick that is. Like, this is very dense, dark ink. There's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo. I'm not sure it's sheen just because it's kind of shiny, but I don't know if that counts. Water test, here you can kind of see where it dyed the page just the tiniest bit. But again, Rhodia actually has a mild ceramic coating added in the pressing process, which makes it kind of unique for the other papers that I test. And you can kind of see in small ways the way it affects results. Like a lot of times during a water test, when I soak up the water, Rhodia will have the page less dyed because just that natural, or that added component just sort of makes it more resistant. But sometimes when it is reversed, it's often because of that reason. But somehow this ink affected it differently. And yeah, I mean, honestly, you can barely see where it dyed the page. The writing barely got any lighter at all. And again, this was after an hour. The recommended time for full permanence is 3 days. Just something to think about. Now, next up is Tomoe River paper, which is known for drawing out shading and sheen and dry times and echo, and we got all of that except the shading, because this ink is just too dark. But I don't know if it counts as sheen, but it got so incredibly shiny. Like, everything shines. All the writing, anywhere this ink is, it just shines. And there's just no shading. It is like, I say it's darker than a singularity. It is dark as a black hole. It is just intense. Now, it definitely did draw out dry times. That Japanese medium took 30 seconds to dry, which surprised me, but probably shouldn't as much as it did. But that broad and wet JinHao took 1 minute and 37 seconds to dry. I just want you to see these smears. Yeah, this paper is very unique. If you are unfamiliar with it, it is very hard to describe. It is so resistant and non-absorbent that honestly what happens is you kind of just have to wait for the water to evaporate and everything just sort of sits on the surface. And this ink does not agree with that method, I guess, so it took a long time to dry. But because of that same sort of method, a lot of times that's why this paper will really just let ink go when you add water, because it's all just sitting on top of the paper. And so when you add water, you're just sort of like, rehydrating it and moving it around. Here, though, that is not the case. That is pretty clear and pretty dark, especially for an hour, when this, for full permanence on regular, more absorbent paper, is recommended 3 days. And this had an hour. The fact that it did this well, I'm actually a bit impressed. Now, there is no bleed, no feather, no spread. You wouldn't expect that with Tomoe River. You do have some echo, because this is a 52 gram per meter paper. This is almost half the density of Clairefontaine. And this is an ultra black ink, and I was using it in a fairly broad and wet pen. If you're sensitive like me, this would bother you. But it's also logical. I mean, it makes sense that this would happen. However, there was something about this that kind of bugged me. As I was doing this test, and, I had to hold on to the paper, and as I got further down, there was kind of less and less that I could hold on to because this took so long to dry. And so I actually set this down, like once I finished this, I set this aside for like 5 or 10 minutes and continued on with the other tests. And then picked it up again so that I could hold on to this while I did the rest of this. But I noticed that it smears. So even after it's dry, again, because it's kind of just sitting on the surface, it can smear. And I made a point of using smear to demonstrate. So that's after about 10 minutes. Because I did that after I had done the water test, because I was like, okay, let's see if it's still smearing. So maybe something to be aware of, but anyways, impressive water test. Now, for the next 3 papers, since they're more economical, I only used that Pilot Metropolitan with the Japanese medium, except to write the name. And this is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper. It is just utter trash. It's highly absorbent, And therefore, we should not be surprised at the sheer intensity of the spread we see here. I mean, if we look at the line width here versus here, that's an intense increase. But I feel like we also shouldn't be surprised because this is a fairly aggressive ink. It has unusual properties it's been enhanced with, and this is very bad paper. So yeah, we have feathering and spread, and we have a kind of woolliness. However, the ink stays very dark. A lot of times on more absorbent papers, it can kind of rob an ink of its intensity, if not its vibrancy, since this is a black ink. And here we don't really get that. Sometimes, like with a weaker black ink on more absorbent paper, it almost starts to look watered out or gray almost. But here we really don't get that. This is an intensely dark black ink. It took 3.5 seconds to dry. We don't really have any shading, but we didn't have much of it in the first place. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that although there is a good bit of show through, there is no full bleed. Because I was keeping very close track of that for these 3 papers because I knew that this was an aggressive, unusual ink. And so as I was doing the test, I made sure to lift it up and see how we were doing. And we got no bleed, which I was actually really impressed with. I was expecting there to be more bleed. However, we do have a significant bit of show through. You can see that on the other side. So if we were looking at the paper like this, but imagine that it was zoomed in so it was that thick, I feel like the ink is fully sinking into the paper, which means it's getting closer to the back, and since it's very dark, it's easier to see. So this might not be the most comfortable thing to use to write on both sides of the paper, but I also wanted to show you this. Do you see how little is coming out the back in the water test? That's pretty impressive. That means that this more absorbent paper sort of sucked the ink in, didn't want to let go, even when it was flushed through with water. So, yeah, I just want you to see this, because, have you seen the paper, how the shape is changing? Yeah, the paper freaked out a heck of a lot more than the ink, because if we look at the ink, that was my bad handwriting, so just ignore that. Look at this. It is exactly as dark. It did not get any lighter at all. It didn't feather and explode, no more than it did up here anyway. It is very well behaved. It is stoic, it is steady. You could absolutely recover that. It would not be a problem at all. Now next up is Mead Notebook Paper. It's very common for school children in the United States. Now this stuff is the kind that you would find in a composition notebook. What does that mean? That means it is very similar in texture to newsprint. And if you've ever tried to use a fountain pen while doing the crossword, you know what the results are. It is very absorbent. It is not very well designed for handling raw ink, and this is an aggressive ink. So I would like to point out, however, that we do not have as much spread as we do on the 20 pound. Though we do have more than we see on the Tomoe River, but it is not as bad. We do have a definite woolly texture. We do have some feathering, but could be a lot worse. It took 2 seconds to dry. Now, as I say here, that on the front, we definitely have echo. That is not up for debate at all. I don't think anyone will will fight me on this. We can definitely see this out the back. However, this paper is actually physically thinner than 20 pound, so the fact that the ink is sinking in and getting closer to the back is really not a surprise. However, I do want to point this out. If you see just how light all of these bits that are showing through are, you see that they're not very dark, they're not very dense, which means that they don't come out the back. And again, I was knowing that I was testing this ink on a newsprint type Mead paper, I was waiting for this to just bleed, so I kept lifting it up and looking. I was shocked by the end of this. The fact that it didn't bleed through this paper, I mean, yes, it's a Japanese medium, but still. I was expecting bleed through everywhere. We didn't get it. It never ended up on the page below, which quite impressed me. Now again, this is a more absorbent paper, so sucks the ink in, doesn't want to let go. But, I mean, we've seen this paper absolutely freak out when we add water. No. I mean, look at that. It didn't feather, didn't explode. Very calm. Barely even started to come out the back, or at least not more than it already was. Absolutely recoverable. So if you do have this in like a composition notebook for like, you know, your chemistry class or whatever, if you don't have to write on both sides and you need an ink that's permanent, because I think we've all had a little accident in the lab once or twice, this ink might be a good option. Just food for thought. Now, lastly is Moleskine notebook paper, which I hate because it's awful. And they make you pay a lot of money for it, and that's not okay. Now, here's where things really start to come crashing down. We actually have more spread than we do on the cheap Mead paper. In fact, we even have more feathering. It took 6 seconds to dry. You can see the texture of the paper despite the fact how dark the ink is dyeing it. I mean, it's... And we had full bleed. You see how dark this is on the back versus these? See how light these are compared to how dark that gets? Yeah, this we got bleed. This rendered onto the page below. Admittedly, it was in a lot of like tiny dots, but I know that would drive a lot of people crazy. Because if you're using this and it's paying for Moleskine and you're like, all right, fine, I'm still only going to write on one side of the page. If you still had dots waiting for you on the next page, that would drive you nuts. It would drive me nuts. So yes, we have spread, we have woolliness, we have feathering galore, and we have bleed. And on top of that, we have echo everywhere else there isn't full bleed. And we got this. I want someone to explain this to me. The world's worst 20-pound copier paper and newsprint type Mead did this. Moleskine did this. What is your excuse, Moleskine? I mean, look, it started to like come apart, and you can see how it dyed. Like once it released some of the ink, it started to dye some of the pulp of the paper under the water test. It started to feather and release. It started to spread. I hate ending on Moleskine. It really puts me in such a bad mood. But yes, anyways, there you go for your consideration from Noodler's Warden series, Bad Black Moccasin. It is an extremely dense dark ink. If for some reason you're worried about lasers, don't, because this has got you covered. Man, it is an ultra black, incredible water resistance, generally well behaved on premium papers. Water resistance is mind-boggling on cheaper papers, and actually the performance could have been worse. It's not perfect, but considering how many like bells and whistles this ink has, it could have been worse on the cheap papers. Yeah, for your consideration from the Triple N Network. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.